The Future Fuels War, Very Different Views on Port Automation, and Reshaping the Container Market. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor at Seatrade Maritime News here, with our October news roundup, Maritime in Minutes, and I'm joined by our correspondent, Gary Howard. We'll be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. This episode looks like it might take a few more minutes than some we do, so let's jump right into it. Gary, how did you start off October in Maritime?
Thanks, Marcus. I'll kick us off with some figures from the Future Fuels War. LNG is very much making a comeback, according to DNV's Alternative Fuels Insights platform, AFI, proving more popular for ship orders than methanol in the month of September. I picked this story as the tussle between methanol and LNG has been sort of elevated in recent months, not least of all because of Maersk's decision to order LNG-fueled new-build vessels, breaking its sort of previous commitment to purely methanol. The industry discussion is essentially around fuel production and availability, with the sort of pro-LNG lobby saying that the fuel is available now, it has a pathway to zero emissions via bio-LNG and e-LNG, while the methanol lobby believes that green methanol is the cleaner fuel and puts more faith in the ability to generate volumes to satisfy shipping demand going forwards. For the 12 months to the end of September, orders for LNG-capable ships were up 57% to 169 vessels, while methanol-fueled ships slipped by 1% to 133. The figures suggest a sort of ebb and flow in confidence for methanol, as orders for methanol-powered ships were outpacing those for LNG ships earlier just this year. We can leave the fuel lobbyists to their squabble, because the DNV figures highlighted the sort of scale of the challenge facing shipping, with 96.9% of the fleet by gross tonnage using conventional fuels, or 99.17% by number of ships. The order book looks much better in that regard, with 41.89% of the fleet by gross tonnage capable of using alternative fuels. The fact that the number is just 16.85% by the vessel numbers shows that future fuel adoption is skewed towards larger ships. There are so many factors involved in fuel choice, not least of all what everyone else is doing, so we'll keep an eye on these and other shipbuilding stats to see how the fleet evolves in the coming years, and at some point I expect we'll see ammonia make more inroads, I suppose.
Yeah, there's some interesting stats there, actually, and particularly about how few ships are currently using alternative fuels. Going back to the start of October, well, actually, the very end of September, we ended the last episode of Maritime Minutes with the impending dock worker strike on the US East Coast. And at midnight on the 1st of October, the strike did indeed go ahead, but it was not the prolonged affair that many had feared, lasting just 3 days before the unions, the ILA, and employers, represented by USMX, reached a tentative agreement on pay. However, it's far from all over. With a tentative agreement on pay, both sides will now return to the table to negotiate the very thorny issue of automation and semi-automation, which was the root cause of the ILA walking away from talks in June and not returning until the strike happened. The two sides will return to the negotiating table in November and have just until the 15th of January next year to reach agreement. Observers and analysts seem far from optimistic about agreement being reached over automation. The union's stance up till now has been one of a flat no to any kind of automation that will jeopardize the existing jobs of its members. A key point in the tentative deal that was struck with the ILA was it retaining the right to strike if the agreement is not reached on automation. It's a potent weapon and one that the unions are clearly willing to use. There was clearly political pressure from the Biden administration for the tentative deal to be struck ahead of the presidential election on 5th November, with the Democrats making their backing for the ILA clear. The unions, meanwhile, continued their traditional support for the Democrats and their candidate for presidency, Kamala Harris. The political urgency of a solution to the dispute will no longer be as acute post the presidential election, and the possibility that employers and unions will fail to agree on port automation is a very real one, which brings with it the threat of renewed US East Coast port strikes early next year. And just a quick note on the presidential election, which is very much described as too close to call. We've had some excellent analysis from our New York correspondent Barry Parker on what the result might mean for shipping, and so be sure to check that out on Seatrade Maritime News. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. Gary, I think you're sort of staying with politics on the other side of the pond for week 2.
I am indeed, and also sort of partially revisiting older story as well. Closer to home for me, this one, the UK government has introduced some legislation to close loopholes exploited by P&O ferries when it made the infamous decision to fire almost 800 seafarers in order to replace them with cheaper agency staff. That story was pretty well covered here in the UK and has left a black mark on P&O ferries' reputation, put it lightly, to the point that the UK Transport Secretary was, at the time of this latest story, comfortable calling the company cowboy operators. A mere 2 years after that firing incident, legislation has been introduced to make fire and rehire illegal unless employers can prove that there is no viable alternative. Operators of foreign vessels will also need to notify the UK government of plans to dismiss 20 or more employees under penalty of prosecution and an unlimited fine. The bill will have to make its way through Parliament, but in the meantime, the new Labour government will implement the Seafarer Wages Act from the 1st of December this year, forcing operators of vessels that call at UK ports at least 120 times per year to pay at least the equivalent of the UK national minimum wage. There is similar legislation on the other side of the channel here in France. This is basically targeting ferry operators and making sure that they're paying minimum wage at least. There was a surprising amount of coverage for the story, not just because the Employment Rights Bill includes legislation that affects large portions of the UK workforce, but because P&O Ferries owner DP World reportedly had its nose put out of joint by the Transport Secretary criticising P&O Ferries, and she even voiced her support for a boycott of the company. In the run-up to a high-profile UK investment summit, DP World reportedly wobbled on its £1 billion new expansion at London Gateway. The investment was announced as planned in the end. All's well that ends well, I suppose.
I guess so. Continuing on with week 2, and I'm going back to alternative fuels. In the second week of October, I attended SIBCON, or the Singapore International Bunkering Conference, which gathers over 2,000 people together to discuss marine fuels. It must be one of the largest niche events in the maritime industry globally, actually. A quick shout out to my colleagues at Informa Markets in Singapore for an excellently organised event on behalf of the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. Alternative fuels were very much in the spotlight, with Singapore as the world's largest bunkering port developing new standards for such fuels. A fast-developing alternative fuel market, though, is drop-in biofuels, which require no expensive modifications to existing ships or changes in bunkering infrastructure. The ability to make immediate gains in reducing emissions is resulting in a quick take-up. Sales of biofuels in Singapore this year were up around 30% in the first 8 months of the year, and now surpass LNG in terms of volume. Further driving demand next year will be the Fuel EU regulation in Europe, which applies to ships trading into the region as well as those within it, with speakers seeing it as a good option to meet the regulation. As with other alternative fuels, there are issues of competition from other industries, such as aviation in particular, for biofuels and the availability of these fuels as demand as a whole grows. There was a need seen from speakers to diversify the sources of biofuels from those which shipping is currently using, which are actually largely used cooking oil.
I covered RightShip's announcement that it planned to lower age requirements for its annual acceptable inspections for bulk carriers next year, and a few days later, Marcus had a piece on Intercargo being unhappy about the whole thing. The current 14-year-old threshold for bulkers would fall to 12 years in March 2025 and to 10 years in 2026 under the RightShip plans, but Intercargo said it's too much too soon. While RightShip said it made the decision after a year of market consultation, Intercargo claimed that it was made without prior consultation with the owners and managers of bulk carriers. It's unsurprising, really, to see the Dry Bulk Association pushing back on increased scrutiny for ships, but I was struck by the sort of weak defence put up by Intercargo, who said they fully support efforts to enhance safety and quality standards. The most concrete complaint to me was, quote, the significant operational challenges faced by seafarers who have already expressed serious concerns over the increasing workload. But I can't help but suspect there are seafarers working on tankers who kind of dream of the dry bulk inspection regime. I suppose inspections are only worthwhile if they actually improve safety outcomes. Maybe that's not a fair comparison. Speaking of which, RightShip shared some data early this year showing a sharp increase in port state control detention for dry bulk vessels over 10 years of age, and figures showing a higher serious incidence and fatalities for bulkers compared to tankers and LNG carriers. The association also noted that the new RightShip inspection regime had only been in place for 2 years and called for a delay to the 2-year phased plan to increase the inspections for older ships. Apparently 2 years, not long enough to get used to it. I think this story is well worth a follow-up, or maybe even a podcast episode, I think, Marcus, as there's surely more depth to both sides of this argument I don't think we've quite got into yet.
Well, it'd certainly be good if we could get both sides to sit down together and talk about the issue, but by the sounds of it, that's actually part of the problem. They're not sitting down together.
Yeah.
But yes, an open invitation to either side if you'd like to come on to the podcast and explain to our listeners about your point of view in more detail. I'm going to look at something rather different. I'm going to be returning to ports. Now, while in the US, employers and unions wrangle over even the smallest amount of automation, in the far west of Singapore, where I'm based, the world's largest automated port is being developed. Tuas Port currently has 10 berths operational, and once fully complete, somewhere in the 2040s, will have a capacity to handle 65 million TEU of containers annually. That is 50% larger than the current port, which is the world's largest transshipment hub. When it comes to transshipment hubs, efficiency is very much the name of the game, as shipping lines have no need to call in terms of the cargo base. But increasingly it appears that just being efficient is not enough, and shipping lines and their customers are looking to value-added services in areas such as logistics. As part of Singapore's aim to stay ahead, it is developing the PSA Supply Chain Hub at Tuas, a 2 million square foot facility within the free zone of the new port. Notably, the groundbreaking for the new supply chain hub was attended by Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, which underscores just how key the port is seen to the island's state economy. Speaking at the ceremony, the PM noted that competition was getting fiercer and more intense, with ports such as Shanghai, Rotterdam and Ningbo Zhoushan upgrading their infrastructure. The PM said, "They are offering value-added services beyond just moving containers. They have cold storage facilities and regional distribution centers to help customers deal with more complex and volatile supply chains. So we too have to sharpen our competitive edge to remain the preferred port of call." And very much part of that competitive landscape, which was mentioned by the Prime Minister Wong in his speech, is the shifting of global alliances of container lines, which, Gary, I believe you are going to talk about next.
Yeah, absolutely. Gemini and MSC will be going head-to-head next year, pitching the direct service model against hub and spoke as the new container alliances take shape from February 2025, or indeed no alliance for MSC. Nick Savides had an interesting piece going over the strengths of each player, including Gemini's 90% reliability target and MSC's giant fleet. Nick spoke to a few analysts for their take on how this will shape the market, looking at sort of three different outcomes, really. Either a straight-up rate war in a market with overcapacity looming, success for Gemini should they reach their reliability goals, or a sort of middle ground where high-value, high-priority cargoes pay the premium for Gemini's more reliable service, and perhaps cheaper freight takes MSC's direct services. As we've discussed before, Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd have a big challenge ahead, with reliability currently just over 50%, a long way to go for their target. If they fall short, it will be a high-profile failure. Everyone is watching, but there are big potential rewards for getting it right as well. Find the link in the show notes to Gemini versus MSC, Titans look to reshape the container market, for a concise rundown of sort of the factors at play in the coming alliance reshuffle and what analysts expect will come from it over the next year.
Yeah, interesting actually. Just before we came onto this, I was reading the latest reliability stats from Sea Intelligence, which were for September, and Hapag-Lloyd has actually dipped below 50% in schedule reliability in September. So they really do have a long way to go. I'm going to come back to another recurring story, and that is the collision between the container ship Dali and the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore back in March. Now, this is set for lengthy legal battles in what could be one of the most expensive casualties of all time. One lawsuit, though, has actually already been settled. That was the one brought by the US Department of Justice. In a settlement of a civil suit, owners Grace Ocean and manager Synergy will pay $102 million, which will relate to the costs of clearing the channels for Baltimore Port, which was blocked as a result of the incident. Grace Ocean and Synergy were very clear that the settlement was not an admission of liability, and said they were prepared to vigorously defend themselves in the limitation of liability proceedings pending before the federal court in Baltimore. The two companies filed a petition in the Baltimore court to limit liability to slightly more than $43 million. The first hearings of that in the shape of scheduling conferences are now taking place, with the petition reported to be opposed by nearly 50 different entities in what is set to be a lengthy case. The state of Maryland is suing for the costs of reconstruction of the bridge, which they estimate to be up to $1.9 billion, in a process that would take about 4 years. So there are some huge claims potentially against the owners and operators, and the court cases around this look like they are going to run for years.
Last one for me in October. I caught up with Norse Power CEO Heikki Pöntönen a little while back to talk about developments at the wind power provider. Heikki took over at Norse Power in May 2024, and we chatted about a range of goings-on at the company, which at the time had just received approval for the explosion-rated version of its rotor sails. But the point that grabbed my attention from our conversation was a transplant of one of its sails from one ship to another. This is a sustainability point I've seen raised by plenty of wind-assisted propulsion system manufacturers. The idea that a sail or wing can be taken from one vessel when it's no longer needed and installed onto another one to benefit from those fuel and emission savings that come from wind propulsion. That's a very simplified version of the process. Wind propulsion systems need foundations to be installed in the ship, and positioning of the sail or rotor is incredibly important to the thrust that they'll generate. But reuse of a product is, of course, a much more sustainable approach than recycling the materials. In the case of rotor sails, that's particularly true because they're made of composites, and composite materials are notoriously very difficult to recycle. This is a problem with wind turbine blades, which are massive and made of composites and have a limited lifespan and need to be recycled. Pöntönen said that Norse Power was carrying out what he called its first recycled retrofit when we spoke, and that the procedure showed there is a resale market for its sails, which introduces interesting financing options such as leasing. As the sails have lifespans beyond 25 years, which is the sort of typical lifespan of a ship, the ability to transfer the system could be good news for older ships. If a market does exist for rotor sails or other systems, and the product retains some value, then there's scope for the systems to be installed on an older vessel. Often old vessels are the most polluting, and using wind power until the ship goes to the breakers, you could then move the sail onto another ship in the fleet or sell it on to someone else and recover some of your investment. I understand that Norse Power are going to send out some more details of that retrofit soon, and hopefully we'll see more examples of sails and wings being reused as time goes on. Marcus, see us out.
Yeah, we'll do that. So that's actually a really interesting development, because that whole issue around recycling these things is something that I think is beginning to sort of gain attention. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to materials as well. I was speaking to Bound for Blue in London last week, and their sails are made of steel. So the recycling isn't as big a deal for them, but obviously if you can reuse that whole thing in its very exact shape once it's been manufactured, then you'll save energy and all the rest of it.
Indeed. I look forward to you continuing to cover that story. I'm going to end this episode with some good news, and that's the end of the saga involving the damaged bulker Ruby, with a cargo of 20,000 tons of ammonium nitrate on board. Having been damaged in storms, the Ruby underwent emergency repairs in Tromsø, Norway, after being detained by Port State Control. The vessel was then expelled from Norwegian waters and limped its way southwards to end up anchored off Kent in the UK. There was a reluctance by any port anywhere to take the ship, given the potentially very dangerous nature of its cargo. Having been stuck off the coast of UK for over a month, the vessel's future was looking rather uncertain, and you really had to feel for the crew stuck on the ship, who seemingly had nowhere to go, and no country willing to take it to unload its cargo so they could head for repairs. However, despite some rather oblique statements by the UK authorities and the vessel's manager, agreement was actually found to bring the Ruby into port in the UK to offload its cargo. The Ruby made its way into the port of Great Yarmouth on the 28th of October to a facility run by Peel Ports. Once the cargo has been fully unloaded, it is expected the vessel will proceed for repairs at an undisclosed yard. I had a look online this morning on a GPS tracker, and the ship is currently still in the port of Great Yarmouth. One of the things about this incident, though, is it highlights the issue around vessels carrying dangerous cargoes and fuels, actually, and what happens to them when things go wrong. As we head into the age of ammonia carriers and the likes, this is going to become an ever more pressing issue. And on that note, that's all we have time for on this episode. If you want to learn more about the stories featured in this episode, links are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.